Earlier this morning, the ABC reported about a school in Tasmania, you may have read this, where parents have complained they were unimpressed with the school's handling of deep fake images. The images were pornographic in nature and affected 21 individual girls and were allegedly shared by groups of boys. There are many contentious parts of this story in terms of what the school did or didn't do, but one of them, interestingly enough, that piqued my interest at least, was a debate amongst the parents about whether they should even tell their daughters that their images were used. Would that contribute to the harms? Deep fakes exist as both stills and videos. Deep fake videos of a sexual nature make up about 98% of all deep fake videos online, and 99% of them depict women and girls. So for scholars who work on gender-based violence, this becomes part of a larger systematic pattern of gendered abuse. But it's fair to say that deepfake images that are sexually explicit are also of children, both boys and girls. As our technology advances far faster than our laws or even our own awareness of it, for those of us who are simply lay people in this space, we are challenged by all sorts of questions. How do we keep our children safe? How can we minimize risk to them? But what rights do individuals have over their own image and the use of it, particularly if we've posted it online ourselves? Do AI-generated or fake images harm in the same way as a real image being shared? And how do we balance the right to privacy versus the need for law enforcement to protect the vulnerable in the digital space? On the flip side, we might ask about whether fake pornography is actually better on a whole than real pornography that harms real people in real life, acknowledging that the use of real here is really problematic. So even what constitutes real and fake and how we draw those boundaries are difficult. And for those of us who come at this from a kind of Christian tradition or an ethical tradition based in Christian thinking, we might ask all sorts of questions about how this constitutes truth, consent, and how human dignity is honoured in this space. So tonight we're going to do this conversationally, and I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn, starting with Lizzie in a moment, and then bring in Mark later, and there'll be a chance for general discussion later on. But let me get to an expert. Welcome, Lizzie.
Thanks so much for having me, Robin. And I just did want to say I'm so grateful to be here. I think it shows real foresight on the part of the Wesley Centre to host a discussion on such an important topic. And also, I just thought your introduction was incredibly thoughtful. The kinds of questions that are philosophical, ethical, religious as well. I think it taps into lots of different facets of our experience of being human. And so I just want to acknowledge it's a very thoughtful and considered introduction. So it's a real honor to be here.
Thank you. Oh, and I'm so pleased you're here. And Lizzie and I have actually known each other for quite a long time, but let me introduce her to those of you who don't know her. Lizzie is a human rights lawyer. She specialises in public interest litigation and has both local and international experience in a wide array of court jurisdictions. She's passionate about equality before the law and how the rule of law should be protected, particularly given incursions on civil liberties that's become part of the war on terror. In 2019, Lizzie received the Human Rights Hero Award for her work campaigning against Australia's encryption laws. She's also co-founder of Digital Rights Watch, which if you don't know them, it's worth looking up, and we'll put a link in the chat, a group set up to defend human rights in the digital space. And she also wrote a book, I think quite sort of ahead of your time, because it's several years ago now, called Future Histories. And I'm going to give the subtitle too, because it's great. What Ada Lovelace, Tom Paine, and the Paris Commune can teach us about digital technology. So we have an expert in the room, and I'm going to hand straight over to you. Lizzie, tell us, I know early in your career you were working on things like Aboriginal land rights. What drew you into the digital space as someone who's concerned about human rights in general?
Yeah, I have worked in a lot of different fields, and one thing about this issue is that it reminds me in many ways of climate change because it's a real ecosystem issue. I think until we solve the kinds of problems that we see in online spaces, it becomes very difficult to find ways through many other kinds of problems because how these online spaces are structured will determine the strength of our democracy. It will determine how our communities are organized, how we engage with each other as people. It is so influential in our daily life, and particularly the challenge of kind of navigating difference, of coming to collective decisions, of understanding what is truthful, of understanding what we agree are important human values.
Mm.
All those things I think are quite heavily influenced by the spaces that we now participate in online. And I think making sure we have a human rights approach to technology policy is very urgent. So it's partly that overarching understanding of the problems and the potential as well. Of course, I'm not a technologist, but I do see great potential for the ways in which technology operates to do good work in that way, to disorganize some of the traditional fault lines of discrimination and division, and to create and foster healthy, strong communities. And so I think there's real potential there too. But it's also because there was a vacuum. There weren't many people working in this space. There still is relatively few, I think, compared to other parts of the world, like places that we might consider similar to ours in terms of the rule of law structure. As I'm saying that, I was about to mention the United States, which I think is probably maybe a shifting comparison,
Yeah.
but certainly places like Europe and parts of Asia where there's strong organizational capacity to frame these kinds of discussions and
Mm.
individuals working in this space. So it's partly also because we saw a gap, me and my other founders of Digital Rights Watch, and we wanted to bring a human rights approach to these questions. And so we thought, we've got to do this work. Like it might,
Mm.
I might be wanting to do other things like relaxing on a beach, but I actually think this is very important, and if we're showing up in our democracy, in our society, this work has to be done. We want to contribute to it, and that's partly what motivated it. So we've seen that a few different times where some of these debates happen in ways that I think aren't as constructive when it comes to
Mm.
understanding human rights implications, and we want to contribute to elevating the quality of that debate.
Yeah, fantastic. Um, and when you think of this, and it is complex when you work in these spaces because, of course, you do have to know, you have to understand enough about the technology to know what you're talking about. So that adds
Mm.
another layer of challenge. But do you think new technologies are throwing up new issues, new challenges to human rights, or are they old challenges in new packaging, if you like? Like,
Thanks for
how
that
do you
nice
think
question,
about that?
Robin. So this is partly some of the theoretical underpinnings of my book. So one of the objectives in writing that book was to say, if you're not a technologist, I still think it's really important that you contribute and engage with discussions about technology because we actually need people who aren't technologists. We need technologists as well. So if you're a technologist and you're interested in these questions, but you feel uncertain because you haven't thought about human rights or ethics or what it is to be a member of your community, building a kind of social movement to hold power to account. I was trying to bridge those two audiences and find common ground. And so the purpose of the book is to try and write a somewhat accessible introduction into how I think history is relevant to some of these discussions we have about technology. There are, of course, new issues, but so many of the fundamental debates we're having are debates we've been having for a really long time. What is the role of people's autonomy in circumstances where corporate interests, government interests are trying to shape how people think about things? What is the role of work versus other parts of your life? How do you create different divisions in that and claim back some of your time from people who want to take it from you? What is it that to be an ethical person building a form of technology, whether that's the looms of the 19th century or it's the AI, the algorithms of the 21st, right? So how do we build technology that is ethical, that is responsive to its community? How do we make sure that power is not concentrated? What are the consequences of those kinds of structures, right? So those are the kinds of issues I wanted to bring to the fore, that actually there's alternatives that we can build that draw on historical precedents, that even though it can feel at this particular moment, there's a lot of darkness in the world. I think a lot of people have
Mm.
confronted that reality and found ways to get through there and found those shafts of light and focused on them and tried to turn them into, a bigger space of light for people to be involved in and contributors to their society. So it's partly motivated to draw out some of those lessons of positive change, as well as understanding how a lot of people in this space, particularly in the tech sector, but generally are talking about these issues as though it's impossible to consider how we could do this well. And well, we're all working through these new issues. And in fact, I think there's a lot we can discern, even at the outset, about tech that we can start now at fixing some of the problems and preventing harms before they occur.
Yeah. So let's get into images in particular, which is how we're framed tonight. And
Mm.
partly, and we'll get to this a bit later, partly because the Uniting Church actually has a letter writing campaign about Grok in particular. So maybe some people here have never actually heard of Grok or have never had to deal with Grok, which is delightful. I didn't know an awful lot about it. Can you tell us what Grok is? We know it's Elon Musk's tech, it's part of X. What is
Mm.
it? Is it unique in the landscape? And what can it do that is concerning people?
Yeah, so people, I'm sure, have heard of Elon Musk. I mean, it's hard to avoid him, unfortunately. But yeah,
Yeah.
he's grouped together a range of companies. I mean, there's a long and storied history of his approach to particularly AI technology that's probably not super relevant for this conversation. But to the extent people want to know more, I can give you a potted history of that. But in essence, he's set up an AI company called XAI. He's put some other businesses in that. So that includes SpaceX, for example, and then also what used to be Twitter, X. And then
Mhm.
there's image generation software, including, things like Grok, as well as AI functionality through XAI. So he's grouped together these businesses. I would say there's a few different ways to think about these companies. I mean, I think they're fundamentally very unethical. But
Mm.
before I move into some of the specific issues associated with imagery, I would just say this company particularly is notorious in AI spaces and discussions about AI policy for some of the ways they've built out data centers as well. So
Mm.
quite a lawless approach. And this is not this the material kind of reality of AI is something that I think a lot of businesses who are in this space want us to ignore. Whereas I think it throws up really serious issues around the energy transition, climate, local communities having a say. And to the extent, I don't want to spend too much time on it because I think people can probably do their own reading, or we can talk about it in the conversation later. But
Mm.
it is notorious for that, and the harms caused to communities are very serious, and the way in which it is non-compliant with basic rules as a company is telling. I mean, X is also like that as well. So the E-Safety
Yeah.
Commissioner has brought a lot of proceedings against X, is constantly asking them to take down content, and they don't respond. So I
Mm.
suppose this issue is there's a couple of different issues. Image generation software, AI, or deepfake imagery is something that there are several platforms that offer that. But I think what comes with something like the XAI group of companies is a sense of lawlessness that is specific, right? Because in particular, in January this year, there was a big campaign to, put women in bikinis in synthetic imagery, which is essentially, non-consensually sexually explicit imagery, and post it on X. In particular, this was started because one of a mother, I was about to say mother of one of Elon Musk's children, the mother of his 13th child is a woman called Ashley Sinclair, and she has had a falling out with Elon Musk, and she was essentially terrorized on this platform, including images generated of her and with her child, right, and sexually explicit images generated of her and posted on this platform. So there was a phenomenon in January where users were doing this, huge numbers of images posted that were sexually explicit of women without their consent, child sex abuse images. So just lawlessness that is reflective of, I think, the entire philosophy of the company. And really, it's a place where kind of edgelords and people who want to be foul and violating of social norms go. And this, I think, is really important because you were talking about how 98% of deepfake imagery is of women and girls, and I think that's a really important statistic to remember. Often, when we talk about deepfake imagery, we think about the impact on democracy and politics of fake imagery in public life during election times or similar, for example, which I think is really important. But the other way it affects our democracy is it really disincentivizes women from being in public spaces because the risk of you having that happen to you is very serious, very real, and it impacts you in a personal way. If you know that this is available to anyone, but also in public life, like one of the key concerns that women put forward for not running for office, for example, is workplace safety. And they include being online and online harassment as one component of that. So to answer the question, what I would describe it as is it's at one end of the spectrum in terms of technology companies, because there are other technology companies that offer this kind of potential as well, but are more inclined to comply with the rule of law. But it is an outlier in some respects in that way. But there are lots of ways in which I think there's a form of ignoring the harms associated with the potential to create this kind of deepfake imagery that is common to other companies in the sector as well. So I think it's something we have to contend with at an industry level. But it is fair to say this is a particularly bad company as well.
That's some helpful context, and I just want to clock that you've named a whole lot of complex issues there. I mean, the
Yeah.
gendered issue is part of it, consent, the way it can be part of online abuse, and then the general lawlessness of people like Musk who think they can do what they like, and partly because maybe our laws or our ability to prosecute in meaningful ways has not been there. Let me ask you one more question, and then I'm going to bring in Mark for some of this conversation. In Australian law, and I apologise to everyone, I have a dog who's lying here groaning and barking, who you may or may not be able to hear, but he's being naughty. In Australian law right now, what mechanisms do we have to hold these more lawless companies like X, Elon Musk's platforms? What mechanisms do we have to actually hold them to account? Because it does
Yeah,
seem like our government hasn't been quite prepared to go hard at this, but I could be wrong.
yeah, I think that's a fair criticism. So, there were prohibitions on sharing sexually explicit content, child sex abuse material, certainly sexually explicit content without consent, right? But child sex abuse material, quite obviously. And I think the question is, what do we do with companies like that? That's one question, like a company that is notorious for ignoring and flouting laws. There is a whole set of other ways in which we could hold companies to account for deep fake imagery created by other kind of notification apps. So we can talk more about this in a bit, but there's a whole range of products that provide this service and they advertise on social media. They make a lot of money. Social media companies make a lot of money from advertising them. They are sometimes recommended by app stores like Google App Stores and Play Store and the Apple App Store, even though those two companies have a stated policy of prohibiting those kinds of apps. So it's not just a Grok problem, is what I would say. So I think there's lots of tools available. Whether the government does something about it is a different question. And at the moment, the way the law is oriented is towards notice and takedown powers. That's a key power that the eSafety Commissioner has. So you can make a complaint to eSafety. eSafety says that they get a lot of this content taken down successfully, which I think is great. But the onus is to make a complaint, right? And they have different ways of regulating companies at a structural level, but I think there's more we could do in that respect. And so there's other ways in which I think we could prohibit the kind of dissemination of this imagery using other mechanisms. But the primary mechanism at the moment is for people to make complaints, get those notice and takedown provisions used by the eSafety Commissioner, and then, potentially prosecuting individuals who might have done this themselves, right? So not the companies necessarily that provide the service, but individuals who do it. And I think that's a very challenging solution to such a problem at scale, I think. So those exist, but I think the times that we're in require us to think about some of those more structural responses to make it harder for these kinds of images to be created and harder for the ecosystem in which they're being facilitated, put more onus on those who hold a lot of information about how this works and get them to stop it because they're in the position of power. So complete eradication might be very challenging in the environment we're in, but I think there's lots we could do to greatly reduce the scope of this problem. But it requires thinking outside of the current rules that we have that I just think aren't sufficient for the scale of the problem.
Interesting. So we might circle back to what some of those things are we can do. Let me bring Mark Zirnsak into the conversation at this point. Mark Zirnsak, for those of you who don't know him, is the Senior Social Justice Advocate for the Uniting Churches Synod of Victoria and Tasmania. And he's been working in that role since 2019, but in the justice advocacy space in the Uniting Church for much longer than that. He seeks social justice on issues like climate change, refugees, modern slavery, regulation of the online world, family violence, tax reform, and more. He served on a number of advisory bodies in both Commonwealth and Victorian governments in these areas and holds a PhD in chemical engineering. Now, Mark, and I'm going to pin you so everybody can see who you are as well. Welcome. Thank you for being here. You, with some other people in the Uniting Church, have started a letter writing campaign in this area. Tell us why you did that, and I'm going to throw my dog outside. Tell us why you did that and why you think the Uniting Church should be in this space.
Look, at the higher level, the Uniting Church has resolutions around dealing. It committed itself to supporting victims of sexual abuse, particularly children. It has taken positions against family, domestic, and sexual violence more generally. For the work at this synod, though, we are guided by what our grassroots supporters also say they want to be active on, and they have indicated both a desire to be active on taking measures to deal with family, domestic, and sexual violence, and also on human trafficking. And some of what happens in the online space intersects or is directly trafficking related, and the AI world is starting to intersect in that trafficking space significantly as well. So we have worked together. There are a few of us who are social justice staff who have been working together. Plus, we also have units across the different synods that deal with church safe culture, and they have also been part of supporting campaigns to see more a regulatory approach to dealing with some of the online harms that are occurring, which include those generated by AI.
And what would you like to see happen? Where do you see maybe a bigger question is, where do you see the main areas of risk, and what ideally would you like to see happen to address some of those risks?
Look, at the high level, we've been very supportive of the notion of safety by design. So corporations shouldn't be producing products that have inherent capacity to commit harm beyond reasonable. Now, there are some harms that it's very hard to prevent users from turning something into. But for example, in terms of generating child sexual abuse material, it's been demonstrated that for models to generate child sexual abuse material, they often have needed to be trained on child sexual abuse material. So occasionally designers have been reckless or negligent in actually checking that the training data they're using doesn't contain child sexual abuse material, and therefore it does. And one of the platforms, I know they had a version that could generate child sexual abuse material. There was a strong reaction to that. They then modified it so it actually struggled to create even adult pornography material. They found users then didn't want to use the new model because so many users wanted to generate pornography and were still using the old model. So they adapted it again so it was better at generating pornography. Now that says, unfortunately, a bit about people using these tools and when these tools are put at people's disposal. So I think there is definitely a role for government to be restraining the profit motive and to trying to make sure that the tools that are designed are safe by design, and that it's not just left to users to use them responsibly where that's possible. Look, we also are supportive of broader system-wide. So the problem Lizzie raised about having to make complaints, actually a lot of child sexual abuse material is automatically detected. So corporations are using detection tools, and there are also third parties that are using. So, people on this webinar, you could look up Project Arachnid, which is run by one of the Canadian child protection organisations. It's a web crawler. It actually scans the web, searching for child sexual abuse material. If it gets a positive hit that it thinks it might be, it's referred to a human agent, to actually a human moderator, to basically double check that it actually is child sexual abuse material. And then it's referred on for takedown, which is basically notifying the platform hosting it to remove that material. So that's an example of automatic detection that's going on as well. And the vast bulk of material that actually gets detected is through these automatic detection tools. A lot of the material, though, is historical. So it's not newly generated material. It's material that's been around for quite a while. But from a survivor's point of view, that is still helpful, because survivors suffer as a result of material of their abuse still being persistently hanging around in the online world.
Yeah, yeah. And the challenges of getting things completely eradicated once they're in digital spaces. Mark, tell us, so Lizzie's talked about how she approaches this through a human rights framework, an extension of that work. How do you come to these issues? Is there an ethical framework you're using, or where do you think the real ethical issues are that you want people to think about?
Look, on this one, the theology strikes me as pretty basic, that,
Yeah.
if you love your neighbour, you don't want your neighbour suffering the kind of severe harms that can occur in this space. There is, in the case of AI-generated material, the AI-generated material, so even when it's a deep fake and there's been no actual direct harm to the person in terms of physical harm, but it's an AI-generated image, it can still result in the sort of harms: humiliation, shame, distress, fear, anger, confusion, and can lead people to self-harm as well, and quite severe self-harm. So there are real harms as a result of AI-generated fake material being out there. And one of the things often law enforcement is doing with survivors and their families particularly is trying to make sure parents are supportive of children when they've been the target of this, to make sure they don't feel those feelings, and to try and mitigate against that. So that's been a really important part of that. So going back to your original question, I think the primary motivation here is that we do care about others, and this is kind of where we want to prevent unnecessary severe harms.
Thanks, Mark. Let me ask this might sound like a slightly strange question to both of you, but earlier this year, the Wesley Centre hosted a conference on gender-based violence, and we had a speaker talking about what's going on in the pornography space and the normalising of violence in that space. And part of that conversation was quite a sort of an interesting debate, if you like, about, is there an argument for fake pornography, like entirely AI-generated images, if it means real actors and real people are less inclined to be hurt in, real life, if you like, if you want to make that distinction. How do you navigate something like that? I mean, you've already given some part of the answer, I think, Mark, in talking about, like, even if it's a fake image, there are impactful harms. But how do we negotiate? Is there any aspect of deep fake AI imagery that could mitigate harms? Or do you just see it as problematic all the way down?
I might start, Mark, if you don't mind, and then you have a crack. But yeah, so I'd start by saying, like, the models don't come from nowhere. So the models have to be trained on something. Somebody has to train the models, because these are not frictionless, labor-free creations. They involve huge networks of people working to label, clean data, to review content, to shape the algorithm. So I think the way in which we see these things is a clean interface with a cursor and clean responses to straightforward questions, whatever it is. But this is not what is the material reality of these models. So the Leon image data set, which is a commonly used, very large image database used to train image generation models like Stable Diffusion. So that's an alternative to the products or companies like OpenAI or or XAI or, lots of different companies, right? That has been found to contain CSAM material. So those data sets contain this material. You can't avoid or you can't create a solution without engaging with that material, I think. And that is I think, to use a theological term for which I'm not qualified to do, an original sin of this field, right? Because you can't get away from the lack of ethical concern shown by some of these companies in these data sets. Now, that's also true for large language models. So very commonly used large language models are also trained on lots of material taken without consent, taken without in breach of copyright, personal information taken. So we know that a lot of images of children have been taken without people's consent and used by many different companies, but also they're quite famously, I suppose, in my world, maybe not here, but in relation to OpenAI, it's documented in a very comprehensive history of the book that came out, history of the company that came out in a book called Empire of AI by Karen Howe earlier this year, late last year. She talks about how the executives thought about how to train some of these models, and at one point were considering whether to exclude pornographic material for the purposes of training image generation models. And they decided to continue using sexually explicit imagery because without it, women's faces weren't able to be rendered in a realistic manner, which I think is quite revealing of the data set, of the content, of the approach of the executives running these companies. They're not actually concerned. They want to take up all the data they can to train these very large models, and they're not concerned about the consequences for people who maybe have a claim on this kind of content or do not want this content used for this purpose. And then also the impact then on the outputs, right? So that produces images of women in a particular way, I think, for example. So I don't think there's a way to create a victim-free, a survivor-free, an impact-free kind of algorithm for doing this work, I would say. And I think if we have to think about, if you want to contend with how you might create ethical pornography, there's a whole other discussion there, I think. But I don't know that kind of tech solution really works in this context. And I think it's sort of our job to interrogate how it is that these companies have done the work of building their systems, because what goes in will influence what comes out. And also we have a responsibility to people who have had this content or are responsible for this content or don't want it used in this way, to listen to them and to shape it accordingly. We also have to think about how we hold executives responsible for this, right? This is a very small coterie of men who run these very large companies and are now claiming that they're very good tools for use in all sorts of contexts, and they want to sell to government, they want to sell to companies. And I think we have to think about that as consumers as well, like not necessarily personally, but certainly like in a procurement sense at a government level. We have to think about how we allow these companies to become entrenched in our lives in circumstances where they've done a lot of things that I think are really reflect really poorly on their ethical position.
Yeah, thanks. Mark, do you want to jump in on that? Or add anything?
Sure. So to build on what Lizzie said, so putting aside, as Lizzie has rightly pointed out, the whole problem of the how you would create the tool that can generate this material, there is a debate between psychologists around, does generating this material stimulate more demand or suppress it? And it's possibly it can do a bit of both. It depends on the individual, but ultimately governments have tended and law enforcement have tended to take the view that the stimulation of demand. So in other words, by generating artificial material, it creates demand for real material. So it doesn't actually suppress it. For some individuals, maybe it does, but overall, the net effect is seen to be stimulation of demand. So you actually create more harm by allowing these kind of artificial images to be generated. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is at the moment, law enforcement say they can still just tell the difference between artificially generated images and real images, but they worry about the time. They believe the time is not far away when that will no longer be possible. And what then happens is police can end up wasting a whole lot of time trying to rescue a child that doesn't exist, or even worse, if they misclassify an image as an artificial image when it actually involves real harm, there might be a victim survivor who they don't rescue because they've misclassified that image. So that's a world that is of concern coming forward. And then further, if this material isn't just for personal use and actually gets circulated, as we've discussed before, for real, if real people's images, faces have been used on this material and, it circulates, then it does real harm to them. And that includes many documented cases of people actually already being recognised, material that's online, and people in the real world actually recognise them from having seen that material online, and they have those encounters in real life, and that causes great distress. So, there's a whole bunch of reasons why allowing this material to be generated is not a good idea.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And if you have questions coming in, those of you listening in, please feel free to start typing them in the chat. We're not far off opening this up for questions. I'm conscious there are some parents in the room and grandparents in the room. Is there anything we can do? So we're going to come back to the big legislative kind of issues in a moment, but at a very practical level, are there things parents and grandparents can do to minimize the risk of your child's face or your own face being used in this kind of way? Lizzie, you've got a 3-year-old. How do you think about this as someone who sees?
I think about this a lot. Like, it's a challenge, right? So, I would say eSafety's got some great resources on this. So, thinking about how you have some of these discussions with your children is really important. So, like, the other thing to say is a lot of these instances in schools where we're talking about generation of imagery, it's also children doing the generation, right? It's kids, right? So, that I think does have add a different complexion to the problem, because they're not legally responsible for what they're doing, but there's a real question here about how having conversations with children, and there's a real question around how, like, there's some really interesting research that from a media outlet in the US called The Indicator, who's done a deep dive into these issues of deepfake image based abuse. And there's a huge amount of interesting data in there, including like some of the things I was talking about before about the ad ecosystem. But they also talk about targeting of young people, right? Like identifying people and then showing them ads for these kinds of products, which I think is really alarming, right? So, I think we have to start having open conversations with our children about how to navigate these online spaces, that these online platforms don't have your best interests at heart, right? That you need to engage with them critically. You need to think about the consequences of how you behave. And these are challenging conversations because kids are still developing and learning. But I think that is an important thing to do, because I think a really bad outcome is when children don't feel like they've got a trusted adult to come to in circumstances where something's going really wrong. I'd like to think children have the opportunity to find an adult like that in their life. And if you can be the adult in their life, that's great. So then, to the extent I think you could do other things, there's mechanisms available for things like takedown and reporting, and that kind of conversation around literacy might be different depending on whether it's a girl or a boy. Those kinds of things are important, but there's lots of ways in which you can find out more about that. I think the other thing to keep in mind, for what it's worth, is that at the moment we're going through a process of developing a children's online privacy code, which I think is fantastic. It is designed to apply to children and all services that might be accessed by children. And it involves things like the right of children to delete content, and the right to have consent for the collection of personal information, negotiating consent with adults in their lives and having those discussions. And actually, it's a really interesting document that I think the Privacy Commissioner has done a really good job in terms of making it very accessible for parents. And I think if you're wanting to have a conversation about this, you could look at that draft code. You can also make a comment on it if you want. And if anyone wants to come, we're going to have a session with the Digital Rights Watch is going to host a session with the Privacy Commissioner. So if people want to learn more about this issue, they can get in touch with me. But it actually talks about some of these issues. And the right to delete personal information is actually really important, especially for children, especially when you leave you leave a daycare center and go somewhere else, or you leave a school. There are so many ways in which children have personal information collected about them. And often these end up in training sets for AI companies, right? And I think understanding the rights that you have and how you can exercise them responsibly as a parent for your child, and discussing that with your child, is a really important thing that you can do, because this is a world they're going to have to navigate whether they like it or not. the Children's Online Privacy Code will create a whole set of rights for them that I think is really positive. And it encourages parents to have those conversations about consent, about limiting what's known about you, about deleting stuff if you need to, about what good consent looks like, what it doesn't look like, what the online information environment is like. And I think that's all to the good. So there's a couple of opportunities, I think, to come into this conversation in ways that aren't really accusatory or ways that don't make people feel scared, but do talk about it as a way to feel like way to take some power back in these spaces. And it's particularly timely at this moment. There's a few resources for that purpose.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And we might collect up some of those and we'll throw them into a follow-up email for you. Mark, do you have
Look,
any?
yeah, the other obvious thing to do is simply not post pictures of your children in public spaces online. Even in private spaces, you might want to be cautious, but at least if you're restricting it to people there's some advantage to that. AI tools can be used to take an image of children and misuse it. Having a briefing with a covert law enforcement agent working in the online space, that was certainly advice. Well, he was sort of saying that might be wise, and I said, what would he personally do? And he said, well, I don't post any pictures of my children in the public space. Frontal face on, okay if it's the back of the head, or even off to the sides with a fair bit of angle in it. The other thing to point out with the AI tools, they can age and de-age as well. So you can actually take an image and generate. You can age it or de-age it depending on what you wish to do, and then use it to create a harmful image. And that includes adults as well. But obviously, I think at the very least we should be far more cautious about posting images of children online, particularly as when they're not consenting to that and can't give informed consent to that sort of harm. They can't possibly imagine the kind of resulting harms that last if something is misused and then persists in the online world for a long period of time to come.
Yeah, and I feel like even in the last decade, we've probably seen a shift in that as we've all become a little bit more aware of not just posting photos of our kids, each other's kids, grandkids, and actually asking permission once children hit teenage years and can give that. Yeah. Let's go back big picture. Daniel's put a question in the chat that I wanted to get to as well, which is in 2024, there was an amendment. The Parliament passed the Criminal Code Amendment that's about the distribution of pornographic or sexually explicit images. And that act was updated to prohibit the non-consensual sharing of sexually explicit material online without consent, and that it applies to both real, as in non-altered material, and material that's been created or altered by technology, such as deepfake AI. So we already have some legislation that says you can't distribute this material in keeping with other sort of laws around that. Where else are the kind of legislative gaps? I mean, you talked about some of them before, but Mark, I don't know if you want to talk about what the letter writing campaign's specifically asking for, or Lizzie, some of the other things you touched on briefly before, but where else are the kind of gaps that we could really advocate for people who want to write a letter or talk to their local MP or something? Yeah.
Look, the stuff that didn't get covered is around audio material. Being in that space, there's a bit of doubt about whether audio-only material is currently captured. Production is also being very explicit that it should capture production, and that it also should extend to the actual design of the tools. So again, going back to that need for things to be safe by design, for designers to not be reckless or negligent in the way they design their tools and what they use to design their tools. Ultimately, beyond the legislation, we are advocating for there to be a compensation fund for survivors as well, which currently compensation is largely restricted to state crimes or in state jurisdictions, not at the Commonwealth level. There are some exceptions to that, terrorism being an example where there is actually the ability to get compensation if you're the victim of terrorism. But they would be, some of the, and then also deep fakes for other non-sexual purposes as well. Things like fraud, fabrication of defamatory evidence are also areas that could be captured in terms of further protections.
Yeah. Lizzie, what else?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot, I don't think there's any good use case for notification programs, right? Like, I don't think anybody even defends them. right? So I think there's a lot of things that we could do to address this. In terms of gaps. So production or facilitating the production of this material should be one. I think there should be strict liability for any platform that advertises any of these kinds of services, right? So social media is not the only way in which people find out about these products, but it is not an insignificant way in which they do. And the exposure to it, like in terms of what they would describe as lead generation. New users of these kinds of products tend to come from social media, right? So, or that there's a greater amount, right? But there's a range of layers of what we'd call the stack, facilitating the functioning of these websites. That is, I think, ways in which we could regulate these things. So you can't just run a website on your own. Usually you need services from a company like Cloudflare that provides protection from different kinds of attacks, helps you get your content working. And that's all fine if you're a lawful business. But there's a question around whether we should permit those kinds of infrastructure businesses to do businesses with companies that create this kind of content or facilitate the creation of this content. So notification platforms, apps and stuff, I think there's lots we could do to target that and minimize the capacity for companies to make money off notification services, including advertising money, including, and then there's a whole other question around monetization of content for engagement, right, that occurs on places like X. So Grok is obviously integrated into X, so you can ask questions and ask Grok stuff on X including to generate images, but also answers to questions. So then you get different kinds of monetization strategies of social media companies. Should you be permitted to monetize content or to pay someone to make content that's particularly engaging to keep people on your platform if it is non-consensual sexually explicit imagery? I don't think you should. So then there's whole things we can do, I think, to prohibit that kind of behavior. So prohibiting the dissemination of it, or an individual creating and sharing, I don't think will cut it because it's too late at that point. I think we should look at other kind of systemic approaches to challenging the business model that is facilitating this kind of problem. Now, I think in some ways it shines a light on the way in which advertising works on social media, which has very little human oversight, right? You can post an ad on major social media platforms with almost no one seeing the content of that ad, with there being very little scrutiny or transparency around what the content of that ad is. And that's true for like deepfake political material as well as sexually explicit material. You can generate and choose audiences that are automatically suggested to you. So Google Ads has been notorious for suggesting Nazi sympathizers as a potential audience for an ad, right? Because it's an automatically generated audience there's almost very little human oversight into this advertising ecosystem. So there's a lot of money being taken in by these companies, but not a lot of responsibility for the consequences of the advertising ecosystem. And so I think it's worth thinking about. I think following the money is really important, and penalizing individuals who do this just doesn't get at the scale of the problem. And I think also it's too late. Now, that should also come with a whole range of literacy, educational kind of things that we need to do, some of the stuff I talked about before, because I do think we need to think about perpetrators as being people who need assistance as well in certain circumstances, particularly when they're children. But, that can be done alongside these more, I think, ambitious ways in which we can target the business models that underpin these problems.
And the systems that are complicit in allowing them to flourish and make money. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up now for questions. Do anyone else have, I don't know if people are just feeling overwhelmed with this introduction into this huge tech space that can seem unwieldy. But if you have a question, perhaps add it to the chat. Lizzie and Mark, do either of you have questions for each other, or anything you've heard from each other you want to sort of a chance to respond to, or argue about, or question more deeply?
I think Mark and I talk a lot about this stuff because we often come at it from different perspectives. And I would say, I think I've always enjoyed talking to Mark about this stuff because we often don't agree on things, right? But we understand we're all in it trying to resolve these problems in different ways. And there are a range of different victims, there are a range of survivors, whatever. There's a range of different actors in the ecosystem. There's a range of different perpetrators, right? So all these problems are often grouped together, but they have kind of complex and different solutions. But, because I think one of the things you said earlier in the intro, Robin, was, how is privacy and law enforcement, the interests of those, people's privacy, but also the need for safety, do they come into conflict? And, Mark and I talk about this a lot. And it's a common conversation in this space because, I'm here arguing for people's right to have their information about them and own it and control it and not and not be able to have that access by law enforcement or whatever in certain circumstances without a warrant, right? And Mark kind of legitimately, makes the claim that there's a lot of work that law enforcement has to do, and they confront this problem of, I think, a kind of weaponized form of privacy, but from companies who say they can't cooperate with them, right? But I think also there's many ways in which those concepts are mutually supportive. Like I think the Children's Online Privacy Code is a great example. Like minimizing children's data footprint is a good thing because, and that's a privacy question, it's also a safety question, right? That priority serves both of those. And I would say that's the kind of space in which I think we both want to work, like where those things become complementary rather than opposed. And when they're opposed, like, this is why I like a human rights approach. Like we have to talk through these things. Like a human rights approach does allow you to move through this. Like there's very few human rights that are absolute. And in fact, most of them are conditional. And then the question is, if one has to be breached, what's the justification? Is it reasonably necessary? It gives you a way of working through these problems. And I think that's a really useful exercise. I think we're less as a society because we don't have a Human Rights Act that allows that to become much more part of our dialogue and discussion. But I can also understand that, people have lots of legitimate ways in which they think rights need to be have an incursion made upon them for a good purpose. And, I think we can differ on some of these questions and still, I think, hopefully have discussions that have the same objective in mind.
Yeah. Mark, do you want to respond?
Mark may have a different view.
I do think, look, I think the privacy one's an interesting one because in actual fact, you've got a conflict of privacy rights. I actually think victim survivors of having your material posted, generated and posted online, that is a breach of your privacy. And so what you often get is you get a conflict between the privacy rights of those who have been abused versus the privacy rights of those generating that material. And my understanding would be, talking to government, generally the view would be you don't have a privacy right to commit harm. Once you're into committing criminal harm, you can't you shouldn't be able to claim that privacy protects you from police being able to gather information about that harm, that somehow, the company owes you an obligation to conceal your criminal activity from law enforcement. Which was an argument mounted by a perpetrator in Canada, for example. And in that case, it led to an outcome where the court upheld the conviction, but in Canada now, law enforcement need to get a warrant to access subscriber data. In other words, if police sort of get onto and see someone's doing something wrong, here in Australia, for example, they can go to the company and get who is the individual behind that identity, that online identity. In Canada, they have to go to court to get a warrant, and that has greatly reduced the ability of police in Canada to deal with. It's reduced the number of cases they can deal with. And frankly, law enforcement is overwhelmed with the level of online harm. So it's a massive pool of harm, and there's a limited amount of resources, which also leads to complete agreement with Lizzie. The solution to this is not arrest and prosecution. That has a role, but it's a very small role. Largely, it's about prevention. It's about how do we actually design an online world that is safe and build respect and is beneficial for people rather than facilitating harm.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. There's a great question here by John Clark. I'm going to read out. What are the political roadblocks to more effective safety solutions? Where do you see political will to act on this or not?
I thought that was an interesting question as well. So thanks for that, John. I feel remiss in not mentioning this, but some of the proposals that we're talking about here, like in terms of potentially prohibiting more or having more structural responses to deepfake image-based abuse, are going to become potentially part of what is called the digital duty of care. So the federal government is committed to introducing a digital duty of care. And what that exactly looks like is going to be interesting, I think. Probably Mark and I will be involved in kind of advocating for things to be included. So there's some discussion of what might be in there, but it's going to focus on psychosocial harm and what that looks like in terms of scope. The idea is also to put obligations on companies and platforms rather than individuals, right? So I think all that sounds good, but I think there'll be a bit of devil in the detail. So we're going to have to work hard to introduce and make sure good things into it and keep bad things out, whatever it may be. So what is the roadblock to that being introduced? I think that's an interesting question. One of the ways in which it kind of started becoming a thing, shall we say, is I think a lot of the crossbenchers were agitating for this and trying to put pressure on the government, the previous iteration of the federal government, previous Albanese government, to introduce this. So it became an election commitment that they introduced or that they talked about in the lead up to the election. So I think there's a real, like, I think full credit to those crossbenchers who do that work. I think they do find ways, even though the government would never admit it, of getting that kind of activity to occur. And then I think there's they've stated recently that they plan to introduce legislation by the end of the year in that respect, in respect of the digital duty of care. So I think we've got to hold their feet to the fire. Probably one of the key barriers that I think that's worth acknowledging is that when Trump took over the White House, the approach to all sorts of technology policy immediately changed. And that includes policy in relation to regulation of AI for all sorts of AI-related harms, e-safety. I mean, Australia features in some executive orders, and we've been singled out as being particularly problematic for the Trump administration in relation to our e-safety legislation. So there is a geopolitical reality in how some of these policies get made. I think there's a real appetite among Australians to have a government that works for them. And, there's a bit of a tension there because politicians are concerned about, retaliatory tariffs, right? But I think there's going to be pressure from their own communities that elect them to act, notwithstanding that risk. And in circumstances where the whims of the White House have been unpredictable at the best of times, so kind of wargaming that doesn't really serve much purpose. So that is, I think, a big shift that has caused some deterrence in legislating. But I would argue that comes up against other kind of tensions for elected reps that put pressure on them to act as well.
Mm.
Look, my take on this would be I actually think the tech corporations in Australia are not very effective at getting their way. In actual fact, I think we've seen governments willing to
Good news,
legislate.
Mark.
Well, I think in terms of some of these online harms, I think they definitely have not been. I think AI is a different kettle of fish, where what we're now seeing is the AI corporate or companies engaged in AI development basically have mounted a very effective campaign to argue they shouldn't be regulated, that if Australia kind of regulates the development of AI, well, then it'll miss out on all the rivers of gold that are going to flow from AI development. And by the way, other countries will get ahead of us and they'll get the rivers of gold and we won't. And they've played this game across a whole lot of governments. So I think in that space, the AI has been far more difficult. But I think on other types of online harm, I actually feel it hasn't been corporate lobbying that's probably restricted. I think there's been legitimate debates about how much power should law enforcement have, when is too much power, and even the law enforcement people would argue that. They say, well, we don't want an NSA type set of powers. We don't need them. We there are legitimate harms we want to deal with, and there are other ones we don't. So I think that's there's a bit of a mixed bag there. But I'm very concerned about this lack of willingness to regulate AI and the ability to do that. And I'm going to agree with Lizzie. I mean, we are seeing there's public documents coming out of the US government revealing the kind of lobbying that the tech companies are doing, and it relates to the Online Safety Act, but it also relates to taxation related legislation that affects the tech corporations here in Australia as well. They want to get rid of there's a particular tax transparency law that they hate, and they're trying to get the Trump administration to inflict tariff penalties on Australia to sort of get us to overturn laws that the tech corporations don't like or the tech billionaires don't like.
Yes, and the role of wealth and the oligarchs in all of this is, of course, adds another layer in terms of, I mean, you've both mentioned power and following the money and those layers as well. I want to pick up Emma's question just at the end. I don't know if either of you have a quick answer on Senator Pocock's My Face, My Rights bill.
I mean, yeah, so I had a bit of I'm a big fan of David Pocock. I think he's often on the right side of many things. So, and I think it's interesting how popular he is, even though I think the government doesn't like him a lot. Because I think he's often doing things that maybe they feel like they should be doing themselves. So I think it's interesting because there is a question here around like what is the right that you have over your own image, and this brings in kind of issues in relation to the creative sector as well, because this is under negotiation as the film industry is transformed and the role of actors in films is being transformed. So there's a whole other discussion around control of your own imagery that relates to some of those questions in the creative sector as well. I mean, I think what's interesting about David Pocock's proposal is that framing is interesting, but then also like civil redress. So one of the things, like I'm a litigator, right? I do a lot of class actions where I seek redress for people who've been wronged. So I am a bit of a hammer and everything looks like a nail to me. But I actually think litigation has a really important role here to play for working in complement with a regulator to create incentives for companies to behave well, because companies like pricing risk. They like feeling like they can find ways to control regulatory situations and regulators and the like, and also that might be involve throwing resources at it, but there's other kind of rent-seeking behavior. And one of the things is that civil redress does upset that. It allows like regulators to do their job, litigators to do their job, and seek compensation for people who've been harmed without having to ask the public regulator to do that. And what I think is interesting is that the recent case against Meta that concluded in favor of the individual who had made claims, Meta and Google, I should say, who'd made claims about addictive behavior. And there's also an associated case in New Mexico about protection and the safety of these spaces, both of which were successful in the same week, has created this new conversation about this. It reflects a shifting social paradigm where people are sick of these spaces being unsafe and designed for engagement and addiction over other concerns. And it does, I think, reframe some of these policy discussions. And I think that's a interesting method for change. And so I like that bit about the bill, because I think we do need to open up that possibility as well. And that may become part of the digital duty of care as well, the right to bring a civil claim for compensation associated with psychosocial harms. And I think that would be a useful way in which we can build up the kinds of risks that these companies feel for not taking action, for being willfully blind to the harmful nature of their products, and then therefore acting because it's in their best interest to do so.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time and we will wrap up in a moment. Mark, do you want to say anything else about the Uniting Churches letter writing campaign and what you would hope? We can send out a copy of the letter to everyone in a follow-up email, but what would you like people to know if they felt compelled to write a letter to?
Look, I'd probably encourage people to say that ordinary people engaging with their government is actually quite important, and it does, particularly on these issues that may not be getting sort of mainstream media attention. It actually really does have an impact on both Minister's Office and public servants about actually showing there's community interest. Some level of community interest and concern about issues always helps nudge government. If there's no one talking about it, often you won't see action in this space. So I think, as much as people might say, well, is it worth me writing a letter? Well, the answer to that is yes. Sometimes if it's a really highly contested area, then your influence is probably less so. But on an issue like this, it actually you can really have quite an impact by engaging around that. And I think that's probably the most important thing I'd want to convey to people.
Yeah, that it's worth the time. I certainly know of enough stories of a politician being able to go in and quote someone in their electorate and say, this is a concern because I've had 5 letters about this, or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be thousands. It can just be enough people taking the time can actually give them a reason to raise it in the platforms they have. Yeah.
That's completely my experience of dealing with lawmakers as well. It has a huge impact. I think you can have a really disproportionate impact by writing a letter, to be honest, more so than you think, because the silence is very impactful as well, an absence of that kind of communication.
Yeah.
I would just say, I just didn't notice John's other comment there about car safety. I don't know if that was me, John, because there's a recent documentary on mis and disinformation that's on the ABC with Hamish McDonald. And in the last episode, I make this comparison. I don't think I'm the only one that has. But also, like, I saw Julia Mangrant talking about this in relation to safety as well. And I think cars are a good example. Like, there was a whole period of time in the mid 20th century where car deaths were blamed on the driver. It was a driver responsibility issue. It was bad rogue drivers that caused death. And now that's completely totally unacceptable. Now people understand that design is hugely important to safety and people expect it. It's now, a market leading position if you can say that your car is safe. So there's plenty of precedents of products that are dangerous, that are widespread, that are used, that have where company, I use this example in my book actually, because I talk about the Ford Pinto case, which you probably all know about, but if you're in law school, it's one of those ones you learn about. But it's exactly this example. And what I would say is like Ralph Nader was one of these big campaigners in the US, subsequent candidate for president. But when he was campaigning on this stuff, he wasn't alone, but he was harassed. Like they followed him, they sued him, they tried to stop him doing this work. So it's not easy. Like I'm not talking about me here, but I think it can be really hard to stand up to these are some of the most powerful, largest companies in human history. And they spend a lot of money on lobbying, right? So it is a challenge, but I think it's a sign that we're doing the right thing if that kind of stuff occurs. I don't want anyone to be harassed or sued by large tech companies, but you know, companies don't siege this without a fight, and we have to take it up to them. Like you have to find ways to try and hold them to account, to shift the dial, to not allow their lobbying to be successful with elected reps. And it does take work, but I think you can make a huge impact. Like I think someone did a calculation of Ralph Nader's unsafe at any speed, and they looked back on how many lives have likely been saved by some of the key reforms he advocated for, including seatbelts and airbags. And they calculate some, like 3.5 million people whose lives would otherwise probably ended in traffic accidents. And I think that's an amazing statistic. And I think this kind of prevention of harm is so important. It's much better to try and create systems that protect people rather than try and find remedies. But we have to do both.
Yeah, friends of mine who work in the tech space say, I've seen a lot of Christians with legitimate and very good ethical concerns about AI in general, not just image generation, but as you named before, data centers, energy use, the impact on climate change and our resources, all sorts of things. And there can be a tendency to opt out entirely. And right now, some of us have that privilege to just say, I won't be in these spaces. I won't be on social media. I won't use AI. The reality is, I suspect for the next generation, AI, it's already in so many things we do. I make social media reels. AI is used to generate captions. I try and minimize my use of it, but there's certain things if you want to do, AI is acting in the background. And so to take the approach of let's regulate, let's talk about safety, let's recognize all technologies go on a bit of a progression, like the car analogy, where we need to work together to do those things, because this is relatively new in our world, in human history, and we're still figuring out who gets harmed and what the balance of those sort of creativity versus harm and safety are, I think. I want to thank you all for giving up some time on a Wednesday night. I want to particularly thank you, Mark and Lizzie, for you do different, but I think overlapping work in these spaces, advocating for safety and human rights. And it's so important we have people like you who, can help us think through these issues in these complex worlds, and help us think about the small part ordinary people can play in writing a letter or thinking about, their everyday activities and actions to keep themselves and their families safe. So thank you. Can we all just thank Lizzie and Mark for their time and input tonight? Really appreciate it.
Can I say thanks, Robin? I just really feel like I get this huge benefit from engaging in these spaces, because I feel like I learn stuff. I also want to be challenged and held to account, because it helps me be a better advocate. It's really nice to find new communities, and especially people who appreciate pets. I fully concur. Mark needs a parrot.
Yeah, I was I saw John's comment.
What a treat.
I could have done it from home, and you could have my two cats, and my daughter would also come up and give me a few hugs
That's
while I
nice.
was on his line. So. Had a bit of movement and colour.
Yeah, sorry. We've all had some animals roaming around. Mark, next time, bring the animals.
I'll bring my cat.
Please.
To the party. And we will
thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, is all I'll say.
Yeah, pleasure. And we will, I think you've heard a lot of stuff tonight. These are complex issues. Some of the threads I've heard is that thinking about the structural aspects to this. So yes, there's work to do with individuals and important conversations to have with young men and young women. But thinking about the structural aspects, thinking about nudification, and that there's really no need ever for that kind of software, and encouraging you, if you have time to think about writing a letter. We will not bombard you, but we'll send one follow-up email, and I will attach the letter writing campaign that the Uniting Church is doing, which just gives you addresses and really practical things about who to write to if you feel so inclined. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Lizzie and Mark, again, and have a good and safe evening.
Thanks, Robin, for the hosting.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.